nice to see everyone. As Andy said, our purpose for this afternoon was really to think a little bit about how SRM is being perceived in what you might call the mainstream climate discussion. I remember when I first got seriously interested in solar geoengineering and SRM, I knew exactly, it was on my birthday in 2007. I had been invited to give a talk up in Calgary. David Keith hosted me. Spent a beautiful day there. The Chinook wind was in, and it was about 70 degrees in January. Later that night after dinner, David and I went out to a pub for a beer, and he started talking to me about the issue. I don't know, I'm sure many of you have had that experience in the last 20 years, but it was, well, maybe not life-changing, but certainly changing in terms of how I thought about the world. And since that time, thanks to David and others, it's been a growing interest of mine. What I think is really exciting, though, is what we're doing here in Cape Town. And I've got to say, I am so thankful to all the organizers of the Degrees Forum, to all the supporters of the Degrees Forum, because this conversation needs to be a global conversation, and you're making it a reality, and that's incredibly important. So let's move on to the actual discussion here. The purpose, I should mention that I was supposed to be moderating this panel with my colleague Joe Aldi, who had some family issues that required him to stay in Cambridge, so he's unable to join us, but I'm sorry Joe can't be here because he would have added a lot of value. We have an extraordinary panel. You've seen Nana Browne Klutse before, earlier today. Why don't you come up and take your seats? Nana's at the Environmental Protection Authority in Ghana and also plays a prominent role in the IPCC. Todd Stern. Todd has been in the US government over a very long time, but you know what? I have no idea where everybody is going to sit, so get comfortable and we'll figure it out. Todd most prominently was the chief negotiator for the US during the Paris Agreement, and has an extraordinary perspective as the chief US negotiator. Next, Baroness Worthington, member of the House of Lords in the UK, very involved in all things climate in the UK and around the world. And finally, Juan Pablo Letelier, part of the legislator from Chile. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about how this topic of SRM looks from the perspective of people that haven't actually worked on it quite so much, perhaps with Nana's exception. But I want to start with you, Nana, because you wear many hats, but one of those hats is as part of the IPCC playing a very important role as vice chair. And within the IPCC, which plays a critical role in the UNFCCC, this is not a simple topic. It has been slightly controversial over the years. Yeah. I'd love to hear your perspective on how this is being treated now by the IPCC.
Thank you. I would say the IPCC comprises government representatives and scientists. So it's virtually the whole world and nations that are members of the United Nations. So we have the scientists who writes, and we have the government who approves. We do dialogue, deliberate, and then approve. What IPCC does is collects publications or research around the world and assess and publish in its report. Let me put it simply. The IPCC made assessment on SRM in the special report on global warming to 1.5 degrees. It did assessment on SRM in the state assessment report, and in the 7th assessment cycle, the main report, we have in Working Group 1 and Working Group 2 also SRM. IPCC is careful, and it's critical on the methods as well as the risks. So this particular cycle, it's more, again, on Working Group 1, looking at the methods, Working Group 2, looking at the risk that's associated with the SRM. So where we have to, probably the IPCC is looking at is the research. IPCC is not talking about deployment, it's only about research. Let me just make it clear here now. So it's not so much of a controversial discussion. It depends on the angle it's coming from or how it is brought up the floor. It's more like research. I mean, deployment is not a discussion at all in IPCC. Research is fine. That's where we are going as IPCC, yeah.
Well, it certainly feels like it's become more normalized, right? I mean, 5 years ago, it would have been maybe pushed aside a little bit.
Yeah, I think it didn't start as a comfortable discussion in the IPCC. I wasn't there in the fit assessment cycle, but I was there in the fit assessment cycle from the 1.1 special report through the main report. I was a lead author, and then now I'm serving as the vice chair. So I would say there's a growing interest and openness in the IPCC on SRM.
Right.
Yep.
Thank you. Todd, let's bring you into this discussion. So I've got to say, you're no longer the U.S. negotiator.
I'm no longer.
I've got to say, I really wish you were the U.S. negotiator.
In fact, nobody's the U.S. negotiator.
Yeah, we may be literally watching the fall of one of the great powers, yes. But imagine you were the U.S. negotiator in those discussions today at the next COP. How do you think, having been here now, and I know that this really hasn't been an issue that's been, in your main field of view until now,
right?
But you've just spent a day and a half or almost 2 days here listening to discussions about this.
Yeah.
How do you think this would play out in these discussions at this point?
Well, so let me, thanks, Stan. Let me just back up for 1 minute. First of all, to say that I think this conference has been terrific, and all praise goes to the degrees people who've put it together. And I'm very glad that I have been able to come because I'm learning a lot. And as you say, I don't come at this from having had experience in science or in SRM. I think that what I do come at it with is experience as a policymaker, to use the lingo here, and a policymaker very much steeped in politics, both U.S. and international. And I think that the kinds of concerns, the kinds of reactions that you're liable to get from people who don't know much about this, which means like basically all the negotiators and the ministers, are a few things. I think first of all, science concerns, not that the science is well known, but still that there may be impacts on the stratosphere. There may be impacts in different regions. There may be impacts in precipitation, et cetera. So just worry about that. I think a very immediate, certainly I have this reaction, but I guess as it'll be shared by others, that what will the impact be on the mission of decarbonization, which I think is the most important thing to do with respect to climate change. And there has been extraordinary tech progress on the green transition over the last 10 years or more, really spectacular. And in solar and wind and batteries and electric vehicles and heat pumps and so forth. And there is a whole robust innovation world out there working on all sorts of other areas, whether it's steel or cement or any number of things going on. And the biggest obstacle to decarbonization is the fossil fuel industry, whether it's national or private. And both in terms of what they do and in terms of who they influence. And so the factor of political economy, what leaders think about, what politicians and countries think about, is what slows things down. And the fossil fuel basically wants to do anything it can do to prolong its license. So they talk about carbon capture and storage. If this really takes hold, they're going to like that a lot. I think what I take away from that is not for a minute that we shouldn't be doing this work. solar geoengineering and SRM and so forth. But everybody working on this has to be on the right side of the decarbonization issue, which is, of course, decarbonization's got to go full speed ahead. Of course, it's the most important priority. But to quote from Jackie Cato, who I thought had a great one-liner yesterday, we have a choice: a hotter world or a geoengineered world. And I think that's true. But you've got to do that through the with a clear eye on the ball of decarbonization. Not that, as I heard somebody say, maybe they didn't quite mean it this way, but we thought this could be a solution, as if the decarbonization, I'm sure that wasn't meant, but that's the way it can come across. I think the other thing that is just going to be massively challenging is governance. And you know, it is very understandable and very accurate that people should worry about inclusion and equity and all of that. It is also true that to get a complicated thing like this done, you can't have everybody. You can't be in the UNFCCC plenary to get something like that done. People have to be heard and people have to be represented, but you need a smaller entity. Yeah,
let's zero in on that for a second, because I think a lot of people aren't aware of how Paris actually happened. I think, you know, some of our perspectives, and as you said, some people may disagree with this. Yes, you can pitch your book, absolutely, and that's a fascinating perspective. But Copenhagen is certainly a start. Yeah. Where the U.S., South Africa, a handful of other countries, India, China, play a critical role in kind of moving away from Kyoto. But then, you know, there was a series of meetings with smaller groups, including the bilateral agreement between the U.S. and China, which was a critical step. Yeah. But you also had the series of other meetings.
Yeah. So I think I agree with you, Dan. And I think most importantly, there was a group of countries that actually President Bush first brought together. Thing is, they brought it together with no idea of what they wanted to do on climate change other than to hope it went away. But they put together a group of 17 countries, which was mostly the G20, other than Saudi, Turkey, and Argentina. So 17 countries. And I had a fixed notion. I'd actually published an article about 2 years before saying there needs to be a smaller group. And my first two COPs had been in Kyoto and Buenos Aires. And one thing I learned was it was a completely chaotic circus, and you couldn't get the dialogue that I thought needed to happen only through that group. So anyway, Bush brought the group together, didn't do much with it. We changed the name. Obama got behind it, and we called it the Major Economies Forum. And over the course of the 7 years, I think it was the most important diplomatic vehicle that we had. There was no bigger supporter of the Major Economies Forum than my good friend Xie Zhenhua from China, because what we did there was we had real conversation. We didn't just read talking points. We didn't just follow the order of whoever flag was up to speak next. We let people go back and forth with each other. And since it was our thing, we were able to set the agenda, and we put the hardest issues on the table every time. And it was a way in which these big players, who were pretty much the biggest players in the world, developed and developing very much, were able to really have a dialogue and really not come to decisions. We weren't negotiating, we were discussing, but I thought it was hugely important.
So that's not preempting the ultimate full negotiation of the UNFCCC?
It didn't preempt at all. And in fact, you know, Kyoto was many people think a failure. It was certainly a mess, but it was actually very important.
Right. Bryony, so now you've been here a couple of days. This isn't an issue that you've spent time on just about every issue in climate, including a lot of work on energy. I first met Bryony, I think we had a big argument about biofuels and thorium reactors. But Bryony, you've had your hand in all sorts of things over the years. What do you think about this as a member of I should say Baroness Worthington, member of the House of Lords?
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, I guess I come at this from the perspective of having worked on a governance framework for mitigation, so for climate mitigation. So the reason I have that weird Baroness title is because I worked on the world's first Climate Change Act as a campaigner and then as a civil servant who helped draft it into law. And that process of working out how do you help solve the problem as we understood it back then, so this is the early 2000s, with a framework that's going to actually make things change in the world, that's going to override short-term politics and make things happen. And we actually borrowed the Kyoto Protocol carbon budgets and just realized that the biggest weakness of Kyoto was there was just one budget of 5 years, which was kind of didn't make any sense. And so we just had a series of carbon budgets set over time that would constrain emissions over time. Because in those days, the problem we were trying to solve was informed by the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution study that was done in the UK that said, by and large, the UK needs to cut its emissions by 60 to 70% over this time frame. And it was expressed as a fairly simple, we cut emissions, everything will be fine. And back then, I think we had a lot of optimism that, if we led, others would follow, and we'd get onto a declining pathway, and this was all kind of doable. But, here we are, 20 plus years later, and whilst I'm really proud of what the UK is doing, and whilst it's amazing to have seen so many other countries copy this framework of reducing emissions, anthropogenic emissions, we are so not winning. It is so not tipped the global curve of emissions. And whilst I'm as optimistic as everyone about, electrification, the sheer number of ways you can produce clean electrons and how you can use them to get off fossil fuels, that's all great. But ultimately, emissions are still rising, and the concentrations of emissions in the atmosphere is rising at a rising rate. And why is that? We're starting slow, and we've started late in turning the tap off of emissions. But also, we're relying on a natural sink that's taking away half of the problem. What happens if that natural sink shrinks? What if it stops being that reliable 50% sponge that's soaking up half of what we do? And I started to look into this just because I was concerned that we were not monitoring these things. The sort of equation I was given by the Royal Commission was too simple. There's way more parameters, there's way more risks, there's way more error bars in all of the science. And so I kind of, whilst I think we've got a path forward towards decarbonization, it's so late in the day that my approach to this now is we need to apply as many opportunities as possible to to buy us some time. Essentially, I see this as a time machine option, which allows us to give us more time to try to protect the sinks that we know are needed, and also the mitigation that needs to happen.
You didn't actually mention SRM. I think that's what you meant at the end, was SRM.
Well, I hate the three-letter acronym of SRM, by the way. I mean, please ditch it. It's got radiation in the middle. No one knows what it is. You need to reframe this for a broader narrative. It's come from science, and it's got to start there. But when you take this out to policymakers, you've got to use much simpler language. I like the idea that we're inventing, we're trying to see if we have a toolkit that could help us repair some of the damage and buy us time. What we call that, I think, is up for debate, but do not select down to three-letter acronyms that no one understands. SAI is no better, by the way. So that's, just when it comes to trying to win that social license that I think you all know you need.
Yeah, interesting. So Juan Pablo, you told me you really don't know anything about this issue, but here you are at this forum, which is interesting. What do you think when you hear this discussion?
First, thank you very much. I want to thank everyone from the Degrees Global Forum that they've invited us here, so that we can listen, so that we can learn. I've mentioned before, I was an MP for 32 years. That's a long time. And I left Congress about 3 years ago. I'm working on climate change under a very complex hypothesis, which is basically that members of parliament don't know what to do. And I say it after having been a member of parliament for a long time. I mentioned a story, everyone likes whales. We love whales, save the whales, with all respect to Japanese and Norwegians. But beyond that, the great majority of us have never seen a whale. But we love whales. We're all worried about climate change. And the only thing that's definite is that it's here and it's getting worse. And there's a lot of consequences. I come from a country which is a little bit long. It's like 5,000 miles or kilometers long. We have deserts, we have Mediterranean climate, we have permanent, the Patagonia, we have the Antarctic. Well, my experience is that we have a big problem from a national point of view and also the global point of view. And what I've been doing this time is working on methane emissions. Because, as Brian said, we need to buy time. And probably reducing methane emissions is the only thing which allows us to see something of change in our lifetimes. That's my conviction. And because of that, I started working with members of parliament. Doing something that people think is a nasty word. Lobbying. Trying to convince people that we have a problem and that they have something to do. I've been very impressed how many MPs who are worried about climate change, if you give them a proposition, a concrete, something on the table, legislative initiative drafts, they're willing to do something. But no one's telling them what to do. And I want to underline this. There's a lot of people who want to do things, but nobody's telling them what they can do. And I'm talking about at least part of the world's representation. I have very little knowledge on SRM. I fully endorse what was just said. It's a lousy name. I'm from a generation who started politics with no nukes. Anything that sounds to radiation sounds bad. So I just would move away from the concept, but I understand that this is a research instrument, and I think we need to get people informed about this. I'm not going to get into the science. I'm ignorant regarding what a lot of the scientists are doing and researchers are doing. I'm not going to talk about modeling. That's not my role. But I do understand we need a lot of research going on. And we probably need to do it more because it can be a useful instrument. The risks probably exist, a lot of them. There are more risks of not doing anything. We're having a bad time. People are getting accustomed to using fossil fuel. It's growing. Methane emissions are growing. We're not getting things well done. We're probably on the right road. As Todd has said, there's a lot that is happening all over. So I appreciate that we can start finding ways to get politicians, policymakers, to understand what this is about. Probably the great majority of people are ignorant. I don't think it's bad to be ignorant. I had a teacher who taught me that it was good to be ignorant. You can go into a dark room, you can stumble on a chair because you didn't know it was there. If you go into that dark room again and you stumble, let's say you could be ignorant. But if you do it a third time, you're stupid. And we need to get out of our stupidity. And I think what this forum is about is helping us all to learn.
Go ahead, Barney.
I was just thinking about this ignorant versus conscious kind of, because there's a lot of debate, I think, about where does this fit in terms of the ethics of doing it. But, the ethics of what we're doing today is under-discussed. There was a period when you could say fossil fuel emissions were an unconscious side effect of modernity or growth. But what we're doing now is consciously emitting into a very dangerous situation. And I think the ethics of that is forgotten because we've just kind of normalized it. Like, we have to burn fossil fuels, which is not true. Like, the fossil fuel industry would like you to believe that that's the case. It's not fast to get off it, but it is possible to imagine a world without it. And so the ethics of what we're doing now is already highly contentious and dangerous. And so then when you come to this conversation, there seems to be an awful lot of concern and worry about ethics and overly estimating, I think, that relative to the fact of what are we trying to do here? We're trying to open up a solution space. It's not a solution in the true sense of the word, but it's opening up a range of things that we could as humanity do to try and save millions of people's lives, or at least make their lives more tolerable. And so it's like the classic, tramway ethics dilemma. How do you do the least harm? And exploring this seems to me absolutely a tiny fraction of the harm compared to just carrying on as we are right now with this acceptance, this kind of tolerance for this unethical activity that's happening.
It's fascinating for me to hear that you voiced that perspective. So let me try an analogy out on all of you, and I'd love to hear your reaction. So even 12 years ago, 13 years ago, I experienced this in 2013, 12 years ago. Certainly in many parts of the US and in Europe, environmental groups and many mainstream climate scientists thought that even the discussion of climate adaptation was almost immoral because it deflected away from reducing emissions. I was working on a report for President Obama in 2013, and I got a call from somebody who almost was President of the United States telling me not to touch the issue of adaptation because it would take away from climate mitigation. Of course, that seems totally absurd 12 years later. It's ridiculous. It seems almost immoral to have thought that. Do you think that this issue, and I hate to call it SRM now, but this issue is in some ways, obviously it's not analogous to adaptation in many other respects, but in terms of its broad discussion in the climate community, do you think there's a similar phenomenon going on? I'd love to hear what anybody thinks about that. Anybody?
Yeah, I think that there's some relationship, and I remember, I again started all the way back in 97 and 98 when I was in the Obama White House, and Clinton White House, sorry. And you definitely couldn't talk about adaptation back then. That was like verboten, and for the reasons that you said. So I think that there's a relationship in that sense, but on the other hand, people react instinctively with worry when you start trying to engineer the world, engineer the atmosphere. And that wasn't the issue at all. There was no worry of any kind like that with respect to adaptation. It is just that, like, you're supposed to keep your eye on the ball in mitigation. So it's similar in that respect, but it is a very common response from people who aren't in this world, and that includes politicians and leaders and everything else, that you're trying to play God, you're trying to monkey with the atmosphere, and how do you know what you're going to, how do you know that you're not going to create problems? And I think there's answers to all of those things, but I think you've got to, on the side of people who want to be going forward, we should, again, my view, going full speed ahead on research, which should obviously be focused on research right now, and be sensitive to, again, underscoring the fundamental importance of decarbonizing, because it's not like this is instead of or a solution to, but then walk people through it. So yeah, some similarity, but it's not quite the same.
Nana, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it never starts in a comfortable way. I think the whole issue of climate change didn't start well. There were a lot of resistance. It's not happening, it's happening. It's not caused by human, it's caused by human. Some quarters didn't want to even hear at all what climate change is, and we are where we are today, believing that it is happening and seeing evidence that it is happening. So this is, I would say, it's a normal trend for seeing the reactions going around SRM, like you've rightly said about adaptation. Now, almost every country talks about adaptation. It doesn't matter from the most vulnerable groups, and even vulnerable, those who have the capacity are also adapting. So it doesn't start always, good, glorying, but it has to start from somewhere. That is where I see SRM going. It started like small discussion, very uncomfortable in rooms and very uncomfortable to open up this discussion, but it is growing. One, it's helping with the knowledge development. We are improving the knowledge and all of that. And two, there are a lot of concern about the risk and research and understanding and governance and all these ethics are coming up for discussion. So I believe that we'll get there to the level where we'll openly discuss SRM and openly have more information to understand what SRM is and what we need to do. It's one thing knowing, and then another implementing.
Yeah.
So for us, we're talking about research. Yes, there are, I would say in the morning I mentioned small scale experiments, deployments here and there. But again, what is small scale? I mentioned that we don't have any global regulation or anybody that regulates this, even the small scale experiments. Some people are also into businesses of SRM, buying cooling credits and all of that. It's really a fractured world, yes, you have put it.
It is a fractured world.
It is, yeah. So in all of these, we must understand how the earth will be affected, the climate will be affected, the people will be affected. That is what we need. And I think the way to start with is the research we are doing.
It's very interesting. I got to say, as a climate scientist, I fear that the level of uncertainty, or let's just say the level of predictability for the exact effects of SRM are never going to be sufficient to, that is, we're going to have to tolerate more uncertainty than most of us would be comfortable with.
Yes,
but that's
true.
The nature of this problem.
Yeah, so because even for the fundamental research we have done, it is clear that we don't have a straightforward evidence to this positive, negative. It's a mist.
Well, I'm not sure that's fair. I think
yeah.
Everything we know says that, on average, doing this would likely reduce the impacts of greenhouse gas induced climate change. But the details, very hard to know.
That's the thing. So for cooling, yes, we can confirm about the cooling, but then what we don't also know is the transboundary effect, the teleconnections, we cannot tell. But then that's for temperature, and then it comes to rainfall, then it comes to humidity, then it comes to other variables of the climate system. And so we need to understand how all of these things will behave now and then in the future.
Yeah, I guess in terms of moving this forward, I'm curious, Todd, when you're sitting if you were sitting back at another COP with all these countries and all the craziness, as you said, suppose you actually wanted to get this discussion on the table. How do you go about it?
I wouldn't go to the COP to do it.
You wouldn't go to the COP to do it.
No.
I knew he was going to say that.
No, but it's a very valid question. But I think, if you spun the ball backwards and we were we had the Major Economies Forum still there, that would be the kind of a place where we might put on the agenda, we've got a new thing we want to start talking about. And it's not that it's going to be kept secret, everybody's going to talk about it, but it's just a smaller group of ministerial level people who can start to have a conversation.
So Pascal Lamy had to go back to France last night, but he created this commission, or he led this commission, the Overshoot Commission.
Yeah.
Do you think the negotiations are impacted much by efforts like that, or do you think maybe something like, prominent feature in the IPCC Working Group 1 report would actually push this on to the negotiating table in a serious way?
Well, I think, I think things like the Overshoot, there's lots of reports, but Pascal Lamy is a quite distinguished and quite respected guy, and I have not read the Overshoot report carefully yet, but I've sort of skimmed through it. After listening to him, I mean to read it, to read all of it. But I think that I think things like that, yes, can have an impact, but there's got to be some reason they stand above, because there's like always lots of reports getting churned out, and many of them don't have that much impact.
Yeah. Is that your sense too, Bryony?
Well,
I was just thinking, where would you go to have this conversation? Maybe the place to start would be WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, as the kind of the progenitor of IPCC, right? It sort of sits above IPCC as the place that was spawned. And because I do think you've got to position this as something new. It can't be seen as an alternative to anything, right? And I've picked up sometimes people use language around, oh, well, this will be so much cheaper than adaptation. That is exactly the wrong way to frame this, because you cannot be seen to be saying, let's do this and not all this other stuff. So it has to be seen as a new category. And how do you signal that newness? You probably do need something dedicated that comes afresh. And the WMO is the place where there's a huge amount of scientific understanding. And they have a standing secretariat that produces a State of the Climate report every year. Like, we all complain about the speed of the IPCC, I'm sorry, but 6 years after the event is too slow. It might have been okay in the 1990s when you thought this was playing out over a century, but here we are now with these impacts. So we've got to speed everything up, and we've got to take a risk framework to all of this. So something new needs to be created. And I feel like a club of willing countries convening through some UN process that's probably neutral. WMO would be a good place to start it in Geneva, and just start the conversation. And I loved Pascal's interventions, and I could see the chess game he's playing, start with a moratorium, but actually really what we want to focus it on is the triggers of when do you lift the moratorium. Well, why do it that way? Why not be more honest and say, we want to work out a set of parameters and know that we're monitoring these parameters to know when we should be thinking about triggering this, right? What is the global weirding index of how bad stuff is, right? I just had a fantastic conversation about, wildfires, right? We can track wildfires, but what we're not tracking is how many wildfires result in dead forests. No regeneration, just standing dead forests. You can see them all over California. And that is irreversible damage, right? So are we tracking that? Where's that parameter in an IPCC report? What are policymakers being given that give us the data for enable us to make an informed decision? Really, the honest truth is 1.5 is a useless metric on any measure, and that's all we hear talked about, and it's not useful for policymakers. It's neither precise enough, and it's too precise. Anyway, don't get me started, but we need better metrics, better parameters, and if Pascal's work takes us down that path, drop the moratorium framing. That's the wrong way around from my perspective, but definitely get us into this conversation about what are the triggers, what are the things we're measuring, so that we know when we need this.
The one thing I would say about the way Pascal is framing it is, and I'm making a guess here, but my guess is he's framing it that way because he is trying to run an exercise which is pretty fundamentally political. And he knows the kind of reaction that he's going to get. And if he's focusing on the moratorium, I think that's probably because that's the way he thinks you need to go in order to get the kind of political support that you need. That might be wrong, but
he was able to win consensus for that perspective.
Yeah.
And maybe not other things.
That's what, I mean, again, I don't know, but
you got to shoot for the stars to get to the moon. I honestly think, don't pre-comply. Like, don't like harness yourself into something negative before you start even allowing us to be expansive about what we're doing here.
So I want to bring in questions from the audience because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for that. But I do want to ask one final question, and this is just maybe because three of us on the panel, for those of you who don't know, Bryony's she's still a member of the House of Lords, but she's living in the Bay Area right now, in San Francisco, but on the peninsula, actually. But three of us live in a country whose climate community is literally under attack. We are watching the crumbling of US government support for climate research, climate science, climate everything. As you say, there is no heir to your position. I'm not sure there ever will be. Maybe there'll be somebody that'll
I wouldn't go that far.
Well, we literally don't know. I don't think we can take anything
Right.
for granted anymore.
Right.
I'm curious to all of you, a world where the UN, and we've seen this before in the first Trump administration, but not to this extent, not to the gutting of climate funding, not to the destruction of USAID, foreign aid for all sorts of energy projects. I think the World Bank is next. We'll see. the disruption by the U.S. disengagement from the world and the disengagement from this issue is profound. And I'm just wondering from your perspective, from Chile, from Ghana, from all around, how does that affect this discussion of SRM? I'm curious about that. Maybe not, but I'm just wondering how you think about that right now. Because, as you said, we're living in not just a fractured world, but a fracturing world. That it may be more fracturing than at least I've ever seen in my lifetime.
There's a saying in Spanish, no hay mal que dure 1000 años. This isn't going to be forever. I'm talking about the political situation.
Yep.
We live with a very polarized world, a lot of people who are not wanting to see or saying they don't want to see how things are. Yes, from my point of view, the Trump era is not good. It's not good in Argentina with Milei. It wasn't good with Bolsonaro in Brazil, in my perspective. We have phenomena of this type all over. It's not just the US. It's more notorious because it's the US. But I don't think that's going to last forever. And I hope it doesn't last too much more. But what we need to do is that all of us do what we have to do. Now, in the South, I don't want to be misunderstood. We had a tradition, especially of those who are more of the left. We used to blame the North. You're the guys who cut the forests in Europe. You're the ones who have cars. That's all true. But in Africa and Latin America, we all want to have cars. We're reproducing the same consumption model. We're doing the same stupid things. We have landfills which are emitting methane without control of any type. Where's the majority of the, meat-producing countries? They're not in the north. They're in the south. We're producing methane. We're probably per capita producing more methane than other places. So we have a responsibility to do what we have to do. I truly believe that we are modifying our climate with emissions. SRM, we do it every day. We're putting trash and particles and CO2 into our atmosphere continuously. And in that sense, I think this is just another dimension of what we have to put on the table to discuss, what we can do, use it as an alternative, but without losing what we want to do. We want to stop contaminating and stop changing climate. It's true that if we do this, or if scientists advance in the research, there are no risks to that. Deployment can be a problem, but investigating is really basic. Now, what we do need is researchers to have more confidence with policymakers, because a lot of researchers don't like policymakers. They want the funds to research, but they don't believe too much in policymakers in some countries. And we need to establish confidence between the scientific community and policymakers so that we can do this together. And I think that's extremely important because it's fractured, but beyond being fractured, we're separated. We need science and politics to walk hand in hand in climate change. And I think that's something we should work better on, of how to get that dialogue going.
That's great. Nana, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think what we're discussing here, the political decisions and the policies and the science borders around our very existence, So the political decisions we make do affect research directions and eventually affect implementation of same. And so, of course, we need to be careful. I advocated this severally in Ghana. People who put at the political front to make decisions for us. It's very important. We are where we are today because we went through an election and there are decisions made that's affecting For Ghana, yes, we've had our own experience of cuts of grants and cuts of funds in different ways. And it's a struggle for most projects that development were centered around. Governments in various countries will have to adjust as they are supposed to be per the direction that they have. And so I would say SRM, I don't know how much funding comes from the US for SRM research, but obviously within the country, they should be affected. I have not had experience of funding from US for my SRM research, but I'm sure some other countries will have that and will be equally affected. But then it's still the general climate research is affected because we have that source cuts, and that limits some research and some findings and eventually implementations or policy direction that influence implementations, yeah.
Thank you very much. We have time for a handful of questions from the audience, and again, I'd appreciate it if you were brief and actually made it a question. Let's start over here, and then we'll go back to the very back here, and we'll try to get as many in as possible. Please.
Hello, thank you for the moral clarity of this panel. Juan Pablo, as you said, we have already plenty of SRM we do through our aerosol emissions. And in practice, the perverse governance of atmospheric aerosols is that it's easier to emit the same aerosols for pollution purposes than it is for researchers to do it for science. How do we move away from that?
Want to pick up
Go ahead.
a number of questions?
Do you want to do one at a time?
So the question was okay.
No, we heard
so
it. Just, do you want to do two or three?
let's do one at a time for now.
I didn't actually hear it, but go ahead.
Well, I think Bryony did hear it.
Yeah.
Sorry.
We'll let Bryony go for it.
Well, so I just had a very interesting conversation. This has been a fantastic learning opportunity. Thank you for inviting me.
Let me be. You want to repeat what the question is?
The question is, how do you approach the fact that it's basically morally okay to emit sulfur particles from our everyday actions, but not to do it to try and potentially cool the planet, right? And so just in the break, I had a fantastic conversation about aviation fuels with Sean Fitzpatrick. ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, is another bit of the UN architecture. They're busily trying to decarbonize aviation, but the truth of the matter is they're currently sources of sulfur pollution, right? And is there a conversation being had at the ICAO, or the other conversation I just took part in is what kind of aircraft are we going to be using to distribute all of these payloads and injection processes? There are fora in which you could start to insert this conversation in a very practical engineering way, which is talking about the composition of fuels that we currently use, the aircraft that we currently use, and their contribution to both damaging the climate, but could they be harnessed for good, right? And trying to be as creative as possible in taking this conversation to the right places is, I think, part of the game, right? And so I'm not saying ICAO can solve this for you, but there is a very real chance that we'll be discussing the sulfur composite of fuels before too long, and that's the time to start talking about this potentially.
Very interesting. In the back.
Thank you for the great panel. I have a question about a lot of the SRM in addressing the loss and damages. In my understanding, there's a lot of debates and an interest and conflicts around like how to address the loss and damages in international negotiations, and particularly how the global north financially compensate in damages happening in developing countries. And so, I mean, I'm wondering, based on your experience in engaging international debates and negotiation, how the SRM come into the debates in addressing the loss and damages? Do you see, like, in the future, in some way, SRM might come into to address preventing the loss and damages in a roundabout way and try to avoiding financially compensating for the damages happening in global south? Thank you.
Todd, the loss and damages fund, I think, has not yet even passed $1 billion.
Yeah,
sort of been a little bit of a disappointment, right?
That's probably right. I don't see a particular connection. I mean, I certainly don't want to think about SRM as the agent that's causing loss and damage. I mean, if we think that's happening, then we shouldn't be using it. And I also don't think that if SRM is, you know, at such point as it's actually being used, if it's successful, I think it just won't have any impact on. But there's going to be there's plenty of loss and damage for all sorts of other reasons. I don't think it really intersects with this.
In fact, it would be dangerous to try and run the argument that it should be funded out of loss and damage. It's a highly politicized debate about North and South responsibilities.
You agree?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the fear of the African group of negotiators, that advancing SRM research will take funding from loss and damage or adaptation fund and all of that. So probably if there's a relationship, probably that's what I can say.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Yeah, that's the fear.
They see it as
It's a fear, though.
somehow an interference.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
That's very interesting. There was a hand down here. You're next. It's coming.
Coming.
Patience. Thank you.
Hi, Hugh Hunt from the Centre for Climate Repair. The UK Act 2028.
2008.
We're nearly halfway to 2050 now. And what are the legal implications of not abiding by the legal framework to be net zero by 2050?
I'm happy to talk about that if anyone else is interested. But I mean, it's kind of relevant, right? Because
It's a little off the subject, but that's
Yeah,
okay.
but
Do very quickly.
Yeah, I suppose the relevance is like if you're trying to design governance frameworks, there has to be some kind of penalty for non-compliance, right? And actually, in the case of the UK's laws on climate change mitigation, it's the government's held to account by judicial review, meaning civil society can sue the government and has sued the government for non-compliance, and so the courts really are the kind of enforcer of that law. And the reality is that carbon budgets process of the UK, we probably will comply. It's a very steep curve, but actually there's enough flexibility in there for us to, even if we have to, use mitigation in other countries towards our target. And actually, ultimately, we should be getting into negative emissions territory to compensate for historic. So I think the UK system is pretty flexible. But for the context of this conversation, it doesn't even remotely consider, was that the right thing to be focusing on? Because we were on this assumption that just reducing man-made emissions and getting to some kind of net position of zero would be enough. But that was 25 years ago when we were discussing this. The evidence in front of us is that has not worked. So now we should be having a different conversation about harm and protection and security and the range of tools that we have as policymakers that can even have an effect on that. And what's changed my view on this topic is meeting people like David Keith and others who have started to conceptualize, would this tool even work? And if it did, what would it look like and how practically could we do it? And I think the more that gets stood up and felt to be real, and is communicated with policymakers, you'll find an appetite for hearing about that, because politicians are quite simple people. They exist to protect their voters, and that's why adaptation actually is never really needed civil society to talk about it, because politicians naturally do it. They naturally gravitate to turning up in their Wellington boots if the town has flooded, or trying to talk about building cooling centers if you're having a heat dome effect, right? This is what they're trained to do, protect citizens in the here and now. So adaptation in the short term is being catered for in that political system. Mitigation isn't, and this conversation is not even yet being considered. So anyway, sorry.
Please.
Turner from SRM 360. It's been very refreshing listening to some of your framing around the conversation today. I was wondering whether, when people talk about SRM, they often introduce it in terms of their fears and concerns and the risks. Are we at a stage yet where it might be okay to start communicating about SRM as a source of hope? Or is that still a little too soon?
Not now.
What do people think? Let's just go down the line. Nana, what do you think?
We can attempt, but I think we will have a lot of backlash at the moment. So it's important to understand the results coming. And if we have a signal of hope, we can start communicating it. For now, we are not sure how it will be. Yeah. If it's positive, yes. If it's negative, yeah, it's zooming. So we can't communicate hope now. We can't be sure. I think.
Again, I think that I agree that that I think trying to go out with a message like that now seems to me, like a broad public message, seems to me to not be the right move, because the message that's going to be taken is, well, they've given up on mitigation, they've given up on decarbonization, so they're going to come up with this crazy science scheme. I think we've got to do much better on decarbonization. Again, we're actually doing very, very well at the level of technical innovation. And if you look at, you know, all of the renewable energy and other things that are not just being discovered or advanced, but they're in use all over and you know, spreading very rapidly, but you're still running up against this political economy problem of the power of the fossil fuel industry, which lives in order to keep doing what it's doing. So you got to really tangle with that. And in the meantime, work should be going on, just like this conference is representative of, but advancing and getting the right people in various countries to start talking about how to do this. And there may well be a point where this can be rolled out as an aspect of hope. It just doesn't feel to me like that's right.
We're not quite there yet.
Not there yet.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not in favor of a narrative of hope, because hope's a really passive verb. It's like, oh, you know, I hope someone does something about that. But actually, I think what could be positively framed is just the power of engineering. Like, just, you know, what humans have done and are capable of doing is phenomenal and kind of awe-inspiring and terrifying. But at the same time, it's the same impulse, right? Which is, don't leave the world as you see it today, but try and change it. Like, that's what engineers are brilliant at. And I feel like that's a message of agency, right? Where there are some things we will never be able to control, like how the biosphere responds to this global experiment we've kicked off. But we can harness our ingenuity, our intelligence, our investment capability to give ourselves a fighting chance. And I think that message, it's not a message of hope, it's a message of agency and action in the face of quite a lot of uncertainty.
Juan Pablo?
I think there are a lot of things that are going on, a lot on renewable energies. I come from a continent in which we're talking about lithium in a massive way. We're talking about green hydrogen. We're talking about energy alternatives. And I think that should be our priority. Let's not get confused that we have to deepen that. And our hope has to be that we're able to change our consumption patterns so that we get that going better. So I'd say let's not lose hope in ourselves that we can get this on the right way, decarbonizing, reducing super contaminants. We need to have this as an information, as an alternative. I think there are going to be a lot of other discoveries and learning processes from the research which is going on. And hence, I don't think that there's any mad scientists here who are trying to do something bad for the planet. They're trying to do something good for the planet and good for people.
There might be one or two. I don't want to just rule everybody out.
But they're a minority.
Okay.
But I think we need to create confidence in this process, not over-dimensioning it, but definitely getting it out.
Yep.
Getting it known, get policymakers to not get scared about this.
Yeah.
I think it has to be responsible, and I think that is possible.
So it's just after 5. We're supposed to stop, but I want to ask one more question for all of you, just as a sort of ending for this panel. And this is the thing that, to me, is the, you know, big thing in my mind since I arrived here for this discussion in Cape Town. So I come from the country that is the world's largest emitter cumulatively, historically, some roughly 500 billion tons of CO2 cumulatively. South Africa, it's about a quarter of the global total. South Africa has emitted a whopping 1% or so, 25 times less than the US. But because of the coal intensity, it's a lot. The rest of sub-Saharan Africa is about 0.6%, all combined. 0.6% of cumulative emissions. Just a simple measure of the ridiculous unfairness of climate change. Absurd. Asking any country in Africa to reduce their emissions it is almost ludicrous, given the history. And yet, it's also essential, given the nature of the problem. In that framing of what some people call climate, I don't use the term climate justice because it's an oxymoron. I'd call it climate injustice. But in that context, where does this whole discussion of SRM fit in your mind? Thinking about your discussions with other countries, your role, whether from Ghana, from the US, from the UK, from Chile, from your perspective as a policymaker of some sort, where does this fit into the whole context of the SRM discussion? And we do need a new term, I agree.
I start?
You can start, Lana, go ahead.
Okay.
We'll go down the row.
Yeah.
And make it quickly, because I think the organizers are probably impatient with me already.
I mean, what we're trying to describe is the ethical dilemma. And in climate science, we are not able to say what we put in forcing is small or big. A small can be big, eventually a big can be small impact. And so all our contributions are important to reducing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and effort to mitigate. Every little effort is equally important. What African group on SRM, what we are looking at is the risk. It's more of the risk. We understand the global picture of SRM trying to cool the earth, but our interest is not just about the cooling. Yes, we were happy to have the world cooled, because eventually, if it happens, we also can be saved from the impact of climate change. But our interest is more of the risk that is associated with SRM. We want to understand how African climate will be like in case we agree to deploy. That's all about us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Todd.
Well, so I guess I think that is a completely legitimate concern on the part of Africa. I think the statistics that you just referenced, Dan, I think is a reason why there is such a thing as climate justice, and there should be. But I actually don't think it has any relationship to SRM. I think if SRM either is safe and works or it doesn't, and if it's safe and works, it helps Africa, and it helps Latin America, and it helps the United States and Russia and everybody else. So I don't actually think, I mean, I think I don't have any disagreement with the statistics that you mentioned, and it's a reason why there ought to be much more funding for poor countries, and that the climate finance is a perennial difficult question. But I don't actually think it's relevant to SRM.
I think it is somewhat relevant, right, in the sense that someone's got to pay for the research, and you know, who's going to find the resources for that? And actually, just recently we saw the UK government with its ARIA suite of grants sort of showing the way a little bit. And someone said that other countries are now saying, "Oh, little old UK is doing that. We should probably do some of that." And that's a kind of example of leading with you know, kind of a moral intent to try and trigger a conversation and have others follow. And I think when we were trying to argue that the UK should go first on legislating for climate change, we used moral arguments of industrial revolution. You know, we were the home of that, so we owe it to the planet to try and do something else. And then by doing that, we'll hopefully start a race to the top, not a race to the bottom. And so there's a dimension to which nations that can afford to, or who are making progress on climate and consider climate to be important. This used to be the case in the US until very recently. You know, you do have a moral imperative to fund this research and work out if it works, and that is an element of paying back this kind of debt that we owe.
Well, I don't have any disagreement with the notion that wealthier countries should pay. That's what I meant by climate finance.
Yeah.
Juan Pablo?
I tend to agree with what Todd has said. I don't think it's part of the same debate. The inequalities of accumulative damage which has occurred. But I want to be honest, and I say, in the third world, we want to copy the U.S.'s consumption model. So I think we have a contradiction. And I think part of the debate is not to repeat what we're doing wrong. So we need to understand that SRM, or whatever it will be called, is not part of this debate of, who accumulated, who did the damage. There has to be there's a debate about financing. It's because poorer countries cannot pay for their infrastructure. It's not that they don't want to, they can't.
Right.
Maybe there's an equation we could write, though, which is, the degree of your sovereign wealth that arises from fossil fuels should dictate how much research you do on all of this, like adaptation, mitigation.
That would help
and
enough
Norway, perhaps Norwegian, if there's any Norwegians in the room, your sovereign wealth fund, could pay for all of this, tomorrow.
That's true.
So before we thank the panel, I just want to leave you with one other thought, which is this is sort of only peripherally related, but I wanted to just plant this in all of your heads because it's something I was thinking about today. I talked with Andrew Light and a few other people about this. Some of us in the audience have raised money for SRM research, private money, and usually the pitch is that the government isn't really funding this directly, at least in the US, not so much, a little bit, but not so much. And so, therefore, this is a real opportunity for private philanthropy to step in and make a big difference. How does that argument change if US federal funding for climate research essentially goes away? It's something that I think is a really interesting question. I'd love you all to think about because we're in a very strange time. And it's worthy of thinking, how do we rebalance in this context, and what is the role of private money in all of this? I want to make a few announcements that the organizers asked me to read before we thank the panel for their very thoughtful and inspiring comments. First of all, right now we have, a little bit less than an hour of drinks, bites, and networking. Please take the time to sign up to SRM 360's daily updates on the conference. Find the details at the top of the agenda page of the website. Then at 6 p.m., there's a screening of Plan C for Civilization. And this is written from the documentary's description, a documentary that follows the push to move solar geoengineering out of the rational cocoon of the lab and into the messy, irrational world of a society in crisis, when faith in science and institutions is eroding and truth and democracy are under attack. And that includes a question and answer with director and producer Ben Kalina. And then tomorrow morning, we're back again with plenary starting at 9, and the organizers encourage you to arrive by 8:45. Please, oh yes, the movie. Where is the movie, organizers? Right here in this room.
That's why they have popcorn.
And Nana, Todd, Bryony, Juan Pablo, thank you all for joining, and please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.